The first time I drove through Mayfield Oaks, it seemed like the quintessential American suburb. Grand oak trees lined the sidewalks, their leaves providing a gentle canopy of shade. The houses, mostly brick or pastel stucco, featured neat lawns with trimmed hedges and flower beds full of petunias or marigolds, each yard a testament to the neighborhood's pride in its appearance. A wooden sign near the entrance read, "Welcome to Mayfield Oaks, where neighbors become friends." The real estate brochure boasted about an active homeowners association, HOA, that handled everything from communal landscaping to organized holiday decorations. "They're quite diligent," the realtor told me, a polite grin masking whatever hidden meaning lurked beneath her words. When I asked her if the HOA was strict, she chuckled. "Well, let's just say they like things structured." At the time, I didn't think too hard about that. The promise of a well-kept neighborhood appealed to me. After years of living in a bustling city apartment, I craved a peaceful suburban life with a yard for weekend barbecues and a safe street for dog walking. Mayfield Oaks seemed perfect, but after I moved in, I discovered that the HOA's diligence was driven by one person in particular, Bethany Arnell, though she insisted that everyone refer to her by her chosen nickname, Karen. A middle-aged woman of average height, with short, layered hair and a habit of wearing pastel blazers, Karen seemed to appear at the slightest hint of a neighborhood issue. Her presence was imposing not because of her physical stature, but because of the authority she carried like an invisible scepter. Karen oversaw the HOA with an iron fist. Any minor deviation, like leaving a garden hose uncoiled on your front lawn, could invite a sharply worded note on your door or an email outlining urgent compliance issues. At first, I tried to be understanding. Perhaps she just cared deeply about the community standards. Maybe her overzealous approach was well-intentioned. But as time went by, her demands escalated, eventually culminating in an absurd edict about wet floor or slippery when wet signs that would lead to an ironic twist. A few months into living at Mayfield Oaks, spring arrived with its temperamental weather. One day it was warm and sunny. The next day it poured rain in sheets, leaving puddles everywhere. After a particularly heavy downpour one morning, neighbors woke up to find sidewalks glistening with residual water. Guttering systems overflowed, forming small rivulets that trickled into the grass. Ordinarily, a bit of rain might mean adjusting your morning routine, wearing water-resistant shoes, or taking a moment to clear some debris from the front step. But for Karen, this was an opportunity, one more reason to micromanage the entire neighborhood's daily habits. That same morning, I shuffled outside to grab the mail, stepping cautiously over the wet concrete porch. I saw Karen standing in the middle of the street, arms folded, scanning the row of houses as if on a personal inspection. Spotting me, she marched over, eyes narrowing at the water droplets on my step. Before I could greet her, she pointed a perfectly manicured nail at the damp spot. "You should be careful," she said, her voice tight. "That could cause a nasty slip." I nodded politely. "Yes, I'll watch my step. Thanks for the concern." Karen pursed her lips. "I'm not just talking about you, dear. I'm talking about visitors, delivery drivers, passers-by. You realize if someone falls on your property, you could be legally responsible, right?" I blinked. "It's just rainwater. I usually dry it off, or it evaporates. But thanks for the heads up." She gave a curt nod and moved on to the next house. I shrugged it off at the time, but the way she spoke, it felt like she was hinting at some big new rule she was about to push. It turned out my hunch was right. That afternoon, an urgent HOA email landed in everyone's inbox, courtesy of Karen. Subject: Mandatory slippery floor / wet surface sign protocol. Dear residents of Mayfield Oaks, in light of the recent rainstorm and the ongoing potential for wet surfaces, the HOA board, on my recommendation, has decided that every household must place a visible slippery floor or wet surface sign at each entry point, front door, side door, back door, to warn visitors of possible hazards. This is for your own legal protection and for the safety of our community members. Please acquire these signs and install them immediately. If you fail to comply, the HOA reserves the right to issue a notice of violation and potentially levy a fine for noncompliance. We must all do our part to prevent accidents. Sincerely, Karen, Head of Safety and Standards, Mayfield Oaks HOA. I stared at my screen, perplexed. A permanent, slippery floor sign was typically something you'd see in a restaurant with freshly mopped tile or in a convenience store on a rainy day, not a permanent fixture in front of a suburban home. Are we supposed to keep these signs out year-round? I murmured to myself. The email implied yes. Ongoing potential for wet surfaces, it said. The neighborhood reaction ranged from befuddled amusement to outrage. Some older residents panicked, rushing to comply because they feared the threatened fines. Others scoffed at the idea. On our neighborhood message board, several folks asked if the board had formally voted on the policy. "She can't just force us to do this," one neighbor typed. Another wrote, "I'll post a sign if there's a real hazard, but not 24/7. Nonetheless, Karen doubled down. She sent out a second email with links to websites selling official wet floor cones and signs. She recommended a certain brand that cost around $30 each. "This brand is highly visible and meets professional safety standards," she declared. "Please note that improvised or homemade signs may not suffice. We need uniformity." That turned a lot of heads. Uniformity likely meant she expected everyone to purchase the same bright yellow commercial sign, the kind you might see in the aisle of a big box store. The thought of those eyesores adorning the front steps of every charming suburban home made me cringe. Yet Karen seemed unstoppable, issuing deadlines and final warnings. Even as neighbors questioned the practicality, she insisted it was a matter of safety and legal liability. Little did she know how ironically her own disregard for proper caution would soon come back to haunt her. A few days later, signs began popping up across Mayfield Oaks. Some residents complied out of fear or a desire to avoid conflict. My neighbor, Mrs. Dixon, a sweet retiree, timidly placed a bright yellow "Caution, slippery when wet" sign at her doorway, right next to a pot of geraniums. She told me she thought it looked ridiculous, but she didn't want trouble with Karen. Others tried to push back. On the private HOA forum, a man named Javier raged about the stupidity of having such an obtrusive sign out 24/7, especially when the weather was clear. "What if it's a sunny day and the steps are dry?" he wrote. "Are we going to mislead people into thinking it's slippery? That's its own safety hazard. People might ignore the sign when it's actually needed." Karen shot back with a scathing reply about how it was better safe than sorry. I personally balked at the idea of paying $30 for a sign I'd likely never use. But I also didn't relish the thought of crossing Karen, who had developed a reputation for issuing violation notices at the drop of a hat. So I decided to pick up a cheaper sign from a hardware store. Sure, it wasn't the professional brand Karen recommended, but it was bright yellow and red "Caution, wet floor." I figured I'd place it near my entrance whenever it rained heavily, hoping that would placate her. Sure enough, Karen swung by to inspect. I remember peering through my window blinds, spotting her tall shape gliding up the driveway. She paused at my front door, looking down at my sign. Then she scribbled something on her clipboard. My heart pounded, unsure if I'd passed or failed her silent test. Later that afternoon, I found a slip of paper in my mailbox, a notice stating, "Thank you for your compliance, but next time, ensure your sign meets standard size requirements, at least 18 inches tall. Consider upgrading to the recommended brand." I let out a frustrated sigh, but at least she didn't threaten me with a fine. Others, unfortunately, weren't so lucky. Some neighbors who refused to buy any sign at all received official violation letters with warnings of monetary penalties. The neighborhood was on edge, each household balancing the cost of placating Karen versus the risk of her wrath. While neighbors tiptoed around the new sign requirement, life in Mayfield Oaks went on. People mowed lawns, walked dogs, and commuted to work. Karen continued her daily rounds, presumably checking for compliance. She also took to sending out stern reminders whenever the forecast predicted rain. "In the event of precipitation, ensure your signage is clearly visible," she'd say. One particularly humid morning, the skies looked threatening, heavy clouds drifting in from the west. I decided to do some light cleaning indoors. Around mid-afternoon, I heard the rumble of distant thunder. Then I received a text from my neighbor across the street. "Looks like Karen is out mopping her front stoop. Something about wanting to keep it extra clean before the rain hits." I glanced out my window to see, indeed, Karen vigorously scrubbing the steps of her front porch, a bucket of soapy water by her side. The scene was somewhat comical, her fancy pastel blazer replaced by a pair of rubber gloves and a determined scowl. She sloshed water across the concrete, creating a soapy froth. It seemed a bit odd to do a deep clean right before a storm, but hey, that was Karen. She prided herself on immaculate surroundings. What no one realized was how much soap she was using. The mixture on her steps became slippery, very slippery. According to a neighbor who watched from her upstairs window, Karen had poured an excessive amount of detergent, presumably to remove every last speck of dirt. Overkill, to say the least. A few minutes later, the storm arrived with a vengeance. Rain pounded the rooftops, wind whipping tree branches and scattering leaves across driveways. Inside my house, I sipped a cup of tea, feeling cozy despite the weather. Then I heard frantic shouting from the street. Curious, I rushed to my window and saw a small commotion near Karen's house. From what I could piece together, Karen had finished scrubbing the porch and went inside. But sometime later, she must have realized she left a window open or another detail undone. So she stepped back out onto the porch, still wet and soapy from her earlier cleaning. The rain had only amplified the slickness, washing over the soap residue. One misstep and thud, down she went, landing awkwardly on her ankle. A neighbor's teenage daughter, who happened to be walking her dog, saw it happen and ran over to help. Karen was in visible pain, wincing as she tried to stand. The porch gleamed with soapy water, a veritable slip and slide. The scene looked downright surreal. This was the same woman who had demanded we all put up slippery floor signs. Yet here she was, a victim of her own carelessness. Word spread quickly. Another neighbor called an ambulance because Karen insisted her ankle felt sprained or possibly broken. The paramedics arrived, carefully helping her onto a stretcher, all while swirling rain splashed around them. A small crowd gathered, huddling under umbrellas, whispering in half-shocked, half-amused tones. And as if the universe was staging the perfect irony, there was no caution sign anywhere in sight on Karen's porch. Karen was taken to a nearby hospital for x-rays, leaving the neighborhood buzzing with gossip. Some expressed genuine concern for her injury. Despite her overbearing ways, no one wanted to see her seriously hurt. Others couldn't help but point out the poetic justice of the situation. She forced us to buy those ugly yellow signs, one neighbor noted, and she didn't even put one up for her own wet porch. The next day, we learned from the rumor mill that Karen had sustained a severe sprain, not a fracture. Still, she'd need crutches or a walking boot for a few weeks. Meanwhile, an interesting development was brewing. The paramedics and the local authorities had asked for details about the circumstances of her fall. Standard procedure, apparently, for any serious slip and fall that required emergency assistance. When officials realized that Karen was the one who had mandated slippery floor signs for the entire neighborhood, they raised an eyebrow at the irony. More importantly, they noted that Karen's own stoop lacked any caution signage, even though she'd publicly demanded every neighbor maintain a sign around wet or slippery surfaces. A few days after the incident, an inspector from the local code enforcement office showed up at Karen's house, presumably to follow up on the conditions that led to her fall. Some neighbors saw them speaking on Karen's porch. Karen, in her walking boot, leaning on a crutch, wearing her usual scowl. The conversation looked tense. She kept gesturing around, possibly making excuses. The inspector took notes. It didn't look like it was going well for her. It soon emerged that Karen had essentially called the authorities on herself by constantly citing safety concerns. Her original campaign to force neighbors to display caution signs had apparently flagged her name at the local municipality's office, labeling her as the Mayfield Oaks safety officer. So when an actual safety incident occurred at her address, the authorities thought it prudent to see if the guidelines she'd imposed were consistently applied. Sure enough, during the official inquiry, they discovered that on the very day she slipped, Karen's porch was extremely slick from soapy water, with no sign or barrier warning of the hazard. This ran afoul of her own stated protocols. If she was truly enforcing a universal sign requirement, she ought to have had the biggest, brightest sign right there on her porch steps. Instead, her stoop was bare, aside from the leftover suds. The final blow came when the local inspector concluded that her soapy porch posed a significant slip hazard, exacerbated by a lack of proper caution signage. This mirrored the exact language Karen had used in her memos to chastise neighbors. In the end, the inspector issued a formal written reprimand under the local safety ordinance, which ironically carried the possibility of a minor fine if not rectified. Karen, humiliated, had to pay a nominal administrative fee, though it wasn't huge. The principle of being penalized for violating her own rules stung deeply. She had become the poster child of hypocrisy, undone by her own overzealous edict. When news of Karen's reprimand spread through Mayfield Oaks, the range of reactions was predictably mixed. Some neighbors admitted they felt a twinge of sympathy. After all, a sprained ankle was no small matter, and Karen had to hobble around on crutches. Others, however, couldn't hide their schadenfreude. One man quipped, "If she'd posted the sign she forced on all of us, maybe she wouldn't have slipped." The neighborhood online forum lit up with half-joking remarks about poetic justice. People shared pictures of their own carefully placed caution signs, ironically pointing out that they hadn't had a single slip accident. A few rebellious souls posted photos of them discarding their signs, declaring that if Karen herself didn't follow the rule, why should they? To douse the flames, the HOA president, an older gentleman named Mr. Bellamy, called for an emergency meeting. He wanted to reassure residents that the association still cared about safety, but recognized that the signage policy might have been excessive. Karen, still in her walking boot, limped into the meeting, face set in a stoic mask. A hush fell over the room. In a brief statement, Mr. Bellamy thanked everyone for their concern about Karen's injury, but announced the board would be revisiting the mandatory sign policy. "We acknowledge that while caution is important, our approach may have overreached," he said diplomatically. Karen, arms folded, looked away, seemingly unwilling to make eye contact with the crowd of neighbors. There would be a vote soon to roll back or modify the sign requirement. Finally, when asked directly if the slippery when wet signs were still mandatory, Mr. Bellamy hesitated, glancing at Karen for a split second. She remained tight-lipped. Then he shook his head. "No. Consider the policy suspended until further notice." A flurry of relieved murmurs spread through the audience. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors filed out, many wearing small smirks of satisfaction. Over the ensuing weeks, Karen's presence around the neighborhood diminished. She still sent the occasional mass email about random HOA matters, like reminding people to keep their hedges trimmed or not to park on certain curbs. But her tone seemed subdued, less commanding. Some speculated that the blow to her ego was worse than the sprain. The sign policy formally died at the next official board meeting. The board introduced a new, simpler guideline. If your porch, driveway, or walkway was unusually slippery, like after a thorough scrubbing, you should voluntarily put out a caution sign until it dried. But there'd be no more mandatory 24/7 signage. Mr. Bellamy apologized for the confusion the earlier rule had caused. Karen stayed silent throughout that part of the discussion, offering no defense or rebuttal. In the aftermath, those bright yellow caution signs disappeared from most doorways, reappearing only if someone actually had a legitimate slip hazard, just the way it should have been from the start. Meanwhile, Karen hobbled about with her walking boot, occasionally confronting a homeowner about some other trivial matter. But each time, the homeowner's expression would say, "Really?" After that fiasco, she never quite regained the same aura of authority. To be fair, a few neighbors did express compassion. Mrs. Dixon dropped off a get-well-soon card, even though Karen had made her spend money on a sign she never wanted. Another neighbor baked cookies. It was a testament to people's fundamental kindness that they could empathize with her physical pain, even if they disapproved of her methods. Still, the whispering never ceased. This soap slip, as people called it, became a legendary anecdote around Mayfield Oaks, a cautionary tale about how an overbearing approach can backfire. I once overheard an older gentleman mutter, "She got a taste of her own medicine, that's for sure." Amid the neighborhood chatter, a more serious question arose. If Karen had been so worried about liability for slips and falls, had she inadvertently exposed herself to potential legal trouble? Indeed, some folks pointed out the comedic irony. She ranted about slip hazards, demanded signs, threatened neighbors with fines, yet her own negligence caused an accident that required emergency services. In a twist, the local authorities who wrote her up also noted that her porch had no rubber mat or slip-resistant coating. That alone wasn't illegal, but combined with the excessive soap and lack of signage, it proved she'd neglected basic precautions. In essence, she'd contravened her own safety standards. Speculation ran rampant. Would Karen's homeowner's insurance balk at covering her medical bills, citing her failure to follow safety measures she mandated? That seemed unlikely, but the rumor was too juicy for some neighbors to ignore. Karen never publicly addressed it, maintaining that the slip was just an unfortunate mishap. If she faced any insurance complications, she kept it private. Nevertheless, the incident set a precedent. If you posture as the neighborhood safety enforcer, you'd better practice what you preach, or the consequences could be humiliating, not to mention painful. As summer arrived, the lawns of Mayfield Oaks sprouted bright green. Flowers bloomed in window boxes, and the memory of the sign fiasco gradually receded into local lore. Freed from the requirement to post slippery floor warnings, neighbors reverted to common sense. If it's wet or freshly mopped, put down a towel or quickly warn visitors with a small sign, and that was that. No one needed Karen's dramatic decree. Interestingly, the sense of community improved after the fiasco. Perhaps it was because we'd all shared a collective experience, a comedic, frustrating, and ultimately triumphant pushback against overregulation. People who rarely spoke before now had a story to bond over. Jokes about soap usage or slippery surfaces became running gags. Karen, forced to slow down by her ankle injury, spent more time indoors. She wrote shorter, less frequent bulletins. On the rare occasions she ventured out, she avoided the topic of wet floors entirely. It was as though she recognized she'd lost credibility, at least temporarily. Some neighbors guessed she might be plotting her next power move, but for the moment, she seemed somewhat humbled. The board, encouraged by Mr. Bellamy's example, began seeking more input from residents. Rather than letting Karen's edicts pass unchallenged, they put proposed policies to a vote, weighed pros and cons, and asked for suggestions. This shift made the HOA less intimidating. While Karen remained on the board, her singular influence had waned. The rest of the board members stepped up, ensuring no more outlandish rules passed without widespread agreement. By the end of summer, Karen was walking more normally. The brace on her ankle was gone. She didn't announce her comeback, but gradually resumed patrolling the sidewalks, glancing at lawns and mailboxes. Yet the dynamic had changed. If she approached a resident with a critique, they'd politely but firmly ask if the board had voted on any new requirement. Without that official backing, Karen had to drop the matter. No more unilateral dictates about house paint color or dog leash lengths. The sign fiasco had taught everyone a lesson about unchecked authority. On one occasion, I overheard her lecturing a young couple about leaving their recycling bin out overnight. The couple simply said, "We'll check with Mr. Bellamy if that's an actual violation." Karen sputtered for a moment, then mumbled something about it being a courtesy. She was no longer the unstoppable tyrant she once was. A few neighbors tried to bury the hatchet with her, inviting her for coffee or a backyard barbecue, hoping to mend fences. She rarely accepted. Pride, it seemed, still overshadowed her willingness to reconcile fully. Perhaps the slip incident was too raw an embarrassment. Nevertheless, the neighborhood pressed on. Kids played in driveways, families hosted block parties, and no one felt compelled to put up a wet floor sign for a bit of morning dew. Common sense reigned, something the community had yearned for all along. Oddly enough, the fiasco did spark a positive change. The HOA decided to sponsor a quarterly home safety workshop, inviting local experts to show residents how to reduce slip hazards, fire risks, or security vulnerabilities. These workshops covered practical tips, like installing non-slip mats, improving outdoor lighting, or using better storage for cleaning supplies. No draconian mandates, just suggestions. Attendance was optional. Some folks found them informative. Mr. Bellamy publicly credited the impetus to the recent incident, without naming Karen specifically. Everyone knew, though, that the fiasco had prompted a more balanced approach. Rather than forcing identical solutions on every household, the HOA would provide guidelines and let people choose what worked for them. That was the spirit of a true community, collaborative, respectful of individual circumstances, and open to discussion. At one of these workshops, I spotted Karen lurking in the back, arms crossed, listening quietly. She didn't offer any lectures, nor did she flash that stern, "I'm in charge" expression. For a moment, I wondered if she felt remorse or a sense of humility. I'd like to think so. Regardless, it was clear she was no longer the central figure dictating how we all lived. The baton had passed to a more cooperative HOA. one less prone to turning small concerns into sweeping edicts. Months turned into a year, and life in Mayfield Oaks settled into a peaceful rhythm. Karen's ankle healed, neighbors carried on with normal routines, and the mandatory sign fiasco became an anecdote told to newcomers. A few in the neighborhood kept their caution signs tucked away in a closet, trotting them out occasionally if they had a leaky hose or a newly mopped porch. Others had thrown them out, more than happy to see them gone. If you ask longtime residents now, they'll describe the day Karen fell as a turning point. Before then, the HOA felt like a micromanaged regime. Afterward, people realized they had more power than they thought to challenge ridiculous rules, and the leadership realized it, too. Karen didn't vanish entirely. She remained a presence, albeit a muted one. Over time, she learned to keep her suggestions within reason, or to phrase them as requests rather than demands. Occasionally, you might catch a glimpse of the old, domineering Karen, especially if she saw a patch of algae on someone's sidewalk. But the memory of her slipping on those soapy steps, with no caution sign in sight, remained a humorous check on her overreach. One sunny afternoon, I strolled past Karen's house with my dog. I glanced at her porch, recalling how it had once been a stage for her humiliating accident. It looked perfectly ordinary now, dry, unobtrusive, with a simple welcome mat. No sign, no soap, no fiasco. As I passed by, I spotted Karen sitting by her front window. Our eyes briefly met. She gave a short nod, not quite a smile, but not a scowl either. I nodded back, continuing on my way. In that moment, I realized the neighborhood had reached a sort of equilibrium. We'd found a balance between caution and common sense, between community standards and individual freedoms. Of course, we'd never forget the day the safety officer of Mayfield Oaks, so keen to impose caution on everyone else, neglected to follow her own rule and wound up paying the price. Yet that moment had taught us more than just the hypocrisy of a single person. It reinforced that communities thrive on cooperation, not coercion. Real safety is a shared responsibility, not a forced display of bright yellow plastic signs. And so we continue, living side by side, grateful for the occasional reminder that even the most stubborn personalities can slip up, literally, and that sometimes, just sometimes, poetic justice arrives in a single, soapy misstep.